let's get into it. This is TeenSpace. Hello and welcome to the TeenSpace Podcast. My name is Danielle, your host, and today we are doing something different. Instead of our usual interviews, this episode is a part of a new series here on the TeenSpace Podcast where we take a recent journal article or study on teen mental health and break it down together. Our goal is to make important research more accessible so we can all understand what the data really says and how it can connect to our lives. TeenSpace has always been a platform for your voice, but it's also about grounding our conversations in evidence. This new series is our way of balancing both, amplifying youth voices while also consulting the science. Before we get into the episode, I'd like to address that a big topic today is about suicide. If you're sensitive toward topics relating to suicide, suicide awareness, and suicide ideations, then feel free to skip this episode for today. Check the description below for helpful resources such as the 988 Crisis Lifeline, as well as our website, www.theteenspace.com. With that in mind, let's dive right into today's study. The topic that this study revolves around has been talked about constantly as of recent. If you've ever heard trending topics such as screen time limits or limiting phone usage, especially in youth, then this is the study for you. Today, we're digging into a big practical question for families and schools. Is it the number of hours kids spend on screens or the way that they use them that really matters for mental health in youth? A recent study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the top medical journals, has a pretty clear answer. And spoiler alert, it's the addictive patterns that wave the flag of real risk. I'd like to preface this episode with the fact that this is simply my interpretation of the article. If you would like to see more about the study itself and see more about what the authors themselves wrote, I will be linking this article in the description below. I will say that you need an account to view the study, but recently, The Guardian also released their own analysis, so if you would like to check that out as well, I'll also link that below. This episode is no way endorsed by the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I'm simply reading this article from my own findings. I have no connection to any of the authors, but I thought that this would be a great beginner study to analyze with you all. Without further ado, let's walk through it together. On June 18th, 2025, so only about 2 months ago, the JAMA network published Addictive Screen Use Trajectories and Suicidal Behaviors, Suicidal Ideation, and Mental Health in United States Youths. Overall, the question from this investigation, which I pulled right off of the website itself, is: are addictive screen use trajectories associated with suicidal behaviors, suicidal ideation, and mental health outcomes in youth? The study we're unpacking followed over 4,200 United States youths from the large ABCD study across 4 years, starting around the age of 10. This team wasn't just counting hours, they tracked addictive use trajectories for social media, mobile phones, and video games, and then looked at whose mental health worsened, including suicidal thoughts or behaviors. Even further, the objective was to identify patterns over time, so who develops more compulsive, hard-to-stop screen behaviors, and whether those patterns predict worse mental health. This has been laid out directly in the abstract and objective sections of this article. And as there has been a significant rise in teen suicide rates and related mental health issues over the last decade, especially because of the recent pandemic and recent social factors, it's been increasingly important for mental health professionals as well as other healthcare providers to find out why and tackle that. As our demographic is mainly comprised of teens, from teen to teen, I acknowledge how common it is to hear from others outside of our generation, or just others in general, that, quote, it's the phones that make us crazy. I think that this study in particular is trying to analyze the validity of that statement and see truly how much phone usage and time spent analyzing media or digesting social media in general affects mental health in youth. Now back to the study. So as I mentioned earlier, this was a cohort study using ABCD data collected from 2016 to 2022 at around 21 United States sites. ABCD data refers to the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which was a large long-term study of the brain and brain development in child health. It was funded by the National Institute of Health, NIH, and researchers were following more than 10,000 children. However, this specific study's sample size was around 4,200. Its overall goal was to track how biological, social, and environmental factors, like screen time, sleep, and family life, affect brain development, behavior, and just mental health in general as kids grow into young adults. This JAMA article mentions ABCD data, and it means the findings are based on this massive, nationally representative dataset, making the results much more reliable and reputable than a small one-off survey. Going back to our study specifically again, addictive use was assisted repeatedly with child-reported items capturing things like urges, escalation, and interference with life. Think, quote, do I feel the need to use more and more? Now let's look at how the researchers actually measured screen use. Instead of just asking teens how many hours did you spend on your phones or how many hours did you spend gaming, they used a survey called the Problematic Media Use Measure short form. This is a set of questions designed to measure addictive patterns of use. Things like whether teens feel upset when they can't use their screens, whether they lose track of time, or whether they've tried to cut back but couldn't. The data came directly from the teens themselves, so it's almost self-reporting. It reflects not just how much they were on their screens, but how much that use felt compulsive or hard to control. Then, to make sense of the results after several years, the researchers used something called growth mixture modeling. Basically, that's a statistical tool that helps identify different groups or trajectories in that data. Again, trajectories is incredibly important because this study was trying to find overall outcome paths. In other words, it showed which teens had low addictive use, which ones developed addictive use gradually, and which ones had consistently high levels of addictive screen use over time. It tells us not just about how many hours were spent on screens, but about the patterns of usage and whether those patterns look more healthy or like an addiction. So, what did the researchers actually find? When they analyzed the data, 3 different patterns of screen use emerged. First, there was a group of teens who showed low, stable levels of screen addiction over the years. In other words, they might have used their screens a lot, but it never rose to the level of being compulsive or hard to control. The second group started off with lower levels of addictive use, but slowly developed more of those behaviors over time. This was called the moderate and increasing group. And finally, unfortunately, there was a group of teens who consistently showed high levels of addictive screen use from the very beginning. Here's where things start to get concerning. The teens in that moderate increasing group, and especially those teens in the high stable group, were significantly more likely to report suicidal thoughts and even suicidal behaviors. These patterns also lined up with higher scores of depression and anxiety. On the other hand, the teens in the low stable group, the ones who didn't really struggle with addictive use, had the best overall mental health outcomes. To put it simply, it's not about how much time you spend on your phone or computer. It's not about what you do. It's about how that time impacts your sense of control, mood, and well-being. And when screen use starts to look like an addiction, the risks for mental health problems go up dramatically. Additionally, if you think of the act or habit of doom scrolling, where you literally cannot stop swiping to the next video, especially as short-form content such as TikToks, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, and the like have exploded in popularity over the past couple years, it's not necessarily the problem of baseline total screen time anymore. It was also shocking because the study revealed that nearly 1/3 of the youth showed increasing addictive use for social media or mobile phones beginning around the age of 11. Now, without extensive knowledge about the developmental process of the brain, it's pretty clear that the ages starting around 11, where youth start to enter puberty, it's incredibly important to have those developmental benchmarks and to be able to connect with the world around them, figure out who they are personally, and grow as they mature into their adult selves. There's obviously the social aspect where youth need to be surrounded by their peers. That's one of the reasons why, as phone usage and screen time has increased over time, many were quick to judge and assume that, a lot of the problems we were facing were simply based on time spent on our phones alone, when it could have been time spent in social environments and interacting one-on-one to peers, analyzing facial reactions, analyzing tones of voice, being able to gauge reactions as well as formulate your own. In general, this age, starting at 11, is incredibly important for the developmental process, where preteens must be thrust into the world as social creatures, as humans are. This 1/3 of youth showing increasing addictive use is incredibly problematic, showing that this addiction no longer just harms mood and patterns and behavior, but also the developmental process of these people. And any kind of developmental issue, whether it is big or small, is incredibly detrimental to who the person becomes when they age, and their character as they interact with others. Analyzing some of the symptom patterns, the high video game addictive group in specific showed the largest jump in internalizing symptoms, where on the contrary, increasing social media addictive use tracked most with externalizing symptoms. I'll go into exactly what that means later, but again, going back to the problem with addictive use, it shows up in real life, and whether you see it in yourself or you see it in others or your friends or your peers in general, you'll see it through sleep disruption and skipping activities or general irritability. You'll see it in mood swings that weren't necessarily common before and show a real sign that help needs to be given. That goes hand in hand with our message here at TeenSpace specifically, that it doesn't matter how alone you feel, there's always someone to help you, and this study in general is meant to help us understand patterns so we can combat them, as I've said before. Whether you feel as if you're in the moderate and increasing group, or even the high stable group itself, this study is only just a warning sign. There are clear-cut ways to help you lower your screen time addiction and practice more beneficial habits. And even further, just because you haven't necessarily shown signs of having low stable levels of screen addiction, there are people out there to help you and activities you can practice to reduce that compulsive behavior and control it. Picking up where we left off on internalizing versus externalizing symptoms, this study again looked at something really interesting about them. Psychologists call them internalizing and externalizing symptoms because even though those terms may sound a little technical, internalizing symptoms are the struggles you carry inward. Things like anxiety, depression, feeling withdrawn, or being stuck in your own head in a painful way. They're often invisible to others, but very real emotions that you feel. They're present in many of the mental health challenges that we've discussed on this podcast. Externalizing symptoms, on the other hand, are the opposite. They're turned outward. This could be acting out, showing aggression, breaking rules, or struggling with impulsivity. These are the things people around you are more likely to notice, especially as your behavior starts to shift towards more of these externalizing symptoms over time. The researchers found that the teens in moderate, increasing, and high stable groups, those with more addictive screen use, scored higher in both areas. This means that screen addiction wasn't just tied to quiet internal struggles like anxiety or sadness, but also toward a more outward disruptive behavior. To me, that's striking because it shows that this issue isn't one-dimensional. Addictive screen use can ripple out, affecting both how you feel on the inside and how you behave on the outside. It can affect your relationship with yourself and your own mind, as well as your relationship with others. When the study talks about internalizing symptoms, we're talking about mental health struggles that get turned inward. Imagine carrying a weight that nobody else can see. I'm sure many of you can relate, but in this moderate to high and high stable groups, this behavior was shown to be increased dramatically. These struggles aren't always obvious on the outside, which is why they can be so dangerous. A teen might be getting straight A's or posting funny TikToks, but still be battling serious pain on the inside. And just because they're able to get straight A's or post frequently with their friends, it doesn't necessarily mean that their pain is less than another's. Excessive screen use might end up replacing real social connection. It'll disrupt sleep and create feelings of isolation, all of which can fuel internal struggles. But the part of the study that really stood out to me, and was the entire reason why the study was conducted in the first place, was the link between screen addiction and suicidal ideation. Again, suicidal ideation means having thoughts of suicide, or even thinking about ending one's life. and the researchers found that the teens in the high stable addiction group were significantly more likely to report these kinds of thoughts. That doesn't necessarily mean that screens cause suicidal thoughts directly. Again, correlation does not equal causation. It's not that simple, but it does show a worrying association. Teens struggling with addictive screen use were also more likely to be struggling with their will to live. For me, this finding is a red flag. It tells us that screen addiction isn't just about lost sleep or too much TikTok time. It can be linked to the most severe mental health outcomes possible, and that means we can't just dismiss it as kids being on their phones too much. For some, it may be a marker of really, really deep pain. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you're not alone. You can call or text 988 in the US to connect with the Suicide Crisis Lifeline. And again, if you at any time need any resources related to suicide prevention and suicide awareness, we have a bunch of them linked in our website at TeenSpace.com. Back to the bigger picture with this article, the author's take is straightforward. Quality and pattern of use, when it starts to look compulsive, tracks with worse mental health and more suicide risk. That reframes the conversation from how many hours to what does the behavior look like and how is it changing over time. With that being the biggest concrete takeaway, what can teens, parents, and teachers actually do with this information? Well, again, look for the patterns. Not just the hours, but see if there's escalating use, if there's distress when separated, if there's the obvious missing of sleep and activities for this usage, and if there's even sneaking. The study focused on many of these patterns, and it's very important that even when you're watching yourself and you're watching your peers, you see if you notice the behavior in yourself as well. Additionally, it may be helpful to shift your goals. If you're realizing that you're falling in that downward spiral, maybe it is time to implement those time limits. Many phones, especially if you have an Apple or Samsung phone, have those built in. There are also behavior goals. You might want to sleep first, or have device-free meals or bedrooms, and structured offline alternatives. Have hobbies that are device-free, whether it's through a medium of art or a creative project of your own. This aligns with the study's implications and press summaries from the research team. If you're really concerned, if you're talking to a therapist, maybe bring it to checkups. Ask your pediatricians or therapists about addictive pattern screening. One small habit is having your phone charging station outside of your bedroom, maybe even on your desk if it's far away enough. It could be really beneficial if you just have that phone detox, or spend a whole 24 hours just looking away from the screens. I understand it's really hard nowadays because everything is so digitized. You can easily do work on your computer or talk to your friends on the phone, but maybe just have a hangout with your friends where whoever touches the phone first has to pay the bill. Moving along, I think it's also important to understand the caveats or limitations of this article. If you're looking strictly at the observational design, we're seeing the associations, not necessarily proof that addictive use causes suicidal thoughts. And again, since this is from the ABCD study, even though the data is large and diverse, every cohort has context. So that might relate to an individual's access to care, family factors, and local policies that weren't considered in the main focus. However, in general, this study helps us look at the bigger picture, as I mentioned before. This paper joins a growing body of research urging us to look past just raw hours. Another 2025 study in the JAMA network similarly found that more time on social media during early adolescence predicted more depressive symptoms over time. Again, focusing on how use evolves. That's why here at TeenSpace, our main goal is to raise awareness. For a quick self-check, ask yourself, do you feel restless or irritable when you can't check your phone or the game you were just playing or any app that you frequently visit? Do you need to feel more satisfied? Are you hiding or skipping sleep, schoolwork, or time with friends because you want to spend more time with your phone? If there are several yeses, especially if you're being honest with yourself, then that's a definite red flag for an addictive pattern. It doesn't necessarily mean that large intervention is required, but maybe it's time to shift your habits, as I mentioned earlier. To close off, again, the main idea was just to look at your phone usage past the hours. It's the hold. Track your patterns, protect your sleep and relationships because they're incredibly important for your development, and get help early if this feels compulsive, even if it's talking to a friend about it, or maybe a counselor, or maybe even your therapist. wrap everything up, this study really highlights how screen addiction in teens isn't just a passing trend or something to brush off. It's tied to real measurable risks, from higher anxiety and depression to more disruptive behaviors, even to suicidal thoughts. Again, all of the research that I shared today comes from the Journal of the American Medical Association Network, titled Addictive Screen Use Trajectories and Suicidal Behaviors, Suicidal Ideation, and Mental Health in U.S. Youths. This article was published on June 18th, 2025. I'll link it in the description if you want to take a look for yourself. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that technology isn't the villain here. It's how easily it can become addictive and replace the connections, routines, and balance we need to stay healthy. I've always been the #1 fan of using social media as a way to promote awareness. By using your phones in a productive and healthy way, you're able to get the most out of this technology and really reap the benefits of being born in a generation where technology is as widespread as it is today. That's something worth paying attention to, both for ourselves and the people we care about. Thank you for listening to this new series where we break down the latest research on mental health. If you found today's episode especially helpful, please share it with your friend or someone you think might benefit. And remember to reiterate, if you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you're never alone. You can call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. I'd like to thank all of the researchers for their hard work on this. I doubt we'll see that, but thank you to the Journal of the American Medical Association for all of this insight. And if you haven't already, try to talk to your schools into getting access to this journal. For more from this podcast, you can check us out again on YouTube and Spotify, where you're definitely listening now. Here at TeenSpace, we've said it over and over. Our goal is to make sure that all teen voices are heard. If you felt particularly strongly about the study or want to discuss it with me, you can always DM the TeenSpace Instagram. And if you have any recommendations for studies to dive deep into, especially on this podcast, feel free to send that through our TeenSpace Gmail or through the Instagram as well. Once again, this was Danielle, your host on the TeenSpace Podcast. But that's all for me for today. Thank you for being in the space with us. This has been the TeenSpace Podcast, and you can find all of our socials in the description below. Bye-bye! Thank you for sharing this space with us.